Join the Korea Pro community and unlock a world of exclusive insights on Korea. As a Korea Pro member, you gain access to articles, expert analyses, and comprehensive reports that keep you ahead on Korean affairs. Plus, enjoy priority invites to our unique events in Seoul that connect you with key leaders and influencers. Elevate your understanding of Korea. Join us today at koreapro.org/podcast. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and we're recording this pre-interview chat on Tuesday, the 5th of March, 2024, and I'm here in the studio with Joe Smith, who started off as one of the top fans of the podcast, and now here he is on the podcast. Welcome back, Joe.
Well, thank you very much. Been listening since 2017. No, 2018.
That's right. 2018. And here we are talking about some things that happened in more recently, but also in 2019. Actually, let's start with 2019 first. Last week, when I was having my pre-interview chat with Yifang, I mentioned that it was the 5th anniversary last week of the failure of the summit of Hanoi between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un. And I understand that North Korea chose to commemorate that inauspicious occasion in its own special way. Joe, how did they do this?
Well, in typical North Korean fashion, they decided not to mention what the international community care about, but instead, they decided that they will celebrate, or use the occasion, rather, to celebrate North Korea and Vietnam relations and Kim Jong Un meeting the Vietnamese, the former Vietnamese president on his trip there. They're celebrating his election from last year, and they decided to say that Vietnam and DPRK relations have never been stronger. And in fact, when Kim Jong Un went there to Vietnam 5 years ago, it was actually, and I've got the quote here, an important milestone. An important milestone. Didn't mention Trump. They didn't mention any of the Hanoi summit that everyone's been talking about recently.
Did it mention the long rail trip and the armoured car, any of those things?
Oh, I didn't mention any of that.
Wow.
No.
Okay. Just off the top of your head, do you know how long North Korea and Vietnam have had relations?
Vietnam was one of the first countries to start relations with North Korea. 1950, I think it was.
Okay.
1950.
Really?
I'm to remember this now. I'm not looking. I think it was 1950. Before the Korean War.
So very, very long. Okay, so it's celebrating that long record of friendship.
Very long.
Plus the meeting that Kim Jong Un had with the then president of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, not mentioning the other fellow who he met while he was there that didn't go so well, and the lunch they didn't share together.
That's very true. Yes, they didn't.
Interesting.
And, I get there's also many reasons why they might not have decided to mention that. However, I did think it was very interesting, and I added this to the piece that me and Junha did. Despite no mention of the second Trump-Kim summit in state media, Kim previously described the meeting in a letter to Donald Trump as a moment of glory that remains a precious memory.
This is after Hanoi.
After Hanoi. I think this was in, again, off the top of my head, I think this was in September. This is and it's from a Bob Woodward book.
Okay.
He has 3 books on the Trump presidencies. I recommend them. They're very good. And one of them focuses a lot on the relationship he had with Kim Jong Un, and he had access to the letters.
Right.
And he described Hanoi, surprisingly, as a moment of glory.
As a moment of glory.
Yeah.
Okay.
But DPRK state media didn't feel the same way, it seems.
Did they share any photographs of Kim's trip to Vietnam, or was it a text article only?
Text article only.
Okay, because if they had shared some photographs, that would have been interesting for the visuals, welcome to Vietnam. Just ignore the American
Trump
flags.
blurred out.
Yeah,
yes.
Ignore Trump. Wow. Okay. 5 years. So I guess in 5 years' time, when it's the 10th anniversary, we may expect another similar article, do you think?
Quite possibly. Yeah. Maybe there'll be a Singapore 10 years or something.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they could have done Singapore 5 years, actually. But yeah.
Right.
We'll see.
Okay. Now, more recently, I think just in the last week or so, there's been a lot of interest, a lot of excitement that after months, nay, years of speculation, Joe, some foreign diplomats finally went back to Pyongyang, not to stay there permanently yet, but just to kind of do a recce, I guess you'd call it in England, go there and see what state the building's in and whether the toilet's still flush and that sort of thing. Tell us about that.
Exactly right. Yeah, well, a source informed us that Well, it was possible that a few European countries were going to be heading there, and the source mentioned Germany specifically. So I emailed the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs straight away, and I woke up the next morning because of the time difference. Suddenly I had a reply. And I think we were the first suddenly English outlet to report on this, that Germany had already sent an inspection team to North Korea.
Right.
They were there for several days. Yep. And they obviously share the embassy with the UK, Sweden, and is it the French?
Well, not only that, I mean, the whole building, multi-story, multi-rooms, the building belongs to the Germans, right? The Germans rent out space to the other embassies, the Swedes and the Germans, but the whole building belongs to the Germans.
That's correct.
I messed up my own sentence there. Anyway, the point is that as masters of the building, they got to go in there and make sure that the building is in a fit state for occupation once again.
Yes.
Before the others, the Swedes and the Brits and everybody else can move in there.
Yeah. And even as I was literally writing the story, this was last week, the Chinese embassy released a statement. The Chinese embassy in North Korea released a statement saying they've met with the officials from the German delegation that were currently in North Korea. They didn't mention the inspection team. So then that even just gave us slightly more information. It just showed that these people weren't there, met with other delegations too.
Interesting. Now, the Chinese embassy isn't given to making a lot of statements from Pyongyang, right? Normally it would be the Chinese foreign minister in Beijing. So this is interesting in and of itself.
Yep.
Do we know if they met the Russians while they were there? I know that the Germans aren't too happy with the Russians these days, of course, because of its war on Ukraine. But,
well,
when you're in Pyongyang, you kind of meet who's there, I suppose.
Yeah, you can't be too picky with your friends, I guess, in the international community. No, well, there was no mention of the Russians, and also interestingly, the Swedish sort of ambassador to be. There's a bit of argument over whether he's yet the ambassador or he currently has officially been appointed the ambassador. But the ambassador, Andreas Bengtsson, was in Pyongyang, and he also met with Chinese officials.
Right.
And that's how we know about it. I didn't know about it. It's just that I'd emailed the Swedes, and they never got back to me saying their ambassador-to-be was in North Korea. They just said they'll send an inspection team when the time is right. Very vague.
Right.
But then suddenly, again, the Chinese embassy in Pyongyang released this article. And
interesting,
with pictures. With
pictures of the meeting.
Pictures of the meetings. Then I knew, and I emailed them back and said, well, you didn't tell me he was in Pyongyang, the ambassador-to-be.
Now, the official terminology, I believe, in English is ambassador-designate, and it's hyphenated until such time as the ambassador presents his or her credentials to the receiving end. They're called an ambassador-designate.
It'd be someone at the ministry. It'd be Ministry of Foreign Affairs of North Korea.
And in the past, that was still a few years ago, that was Kim Jong Un, who's now retired. He's in his 90s if he's still with us on this earth. Who that is now, I don't know. Perhaps Madame Che Son-hee. It could be the foreign minister. It
could be. I believe when Nicaragua said that they were sending an ambassador to hand over their papers, it was
ambassador-designate.
Ambassador-designate. It was to Che Son-hee. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then after that, once you've handed in your papers, you've presented your credentials, then you become an official.
That's the word I was looking for. Credentials.
You become an official ambassador. You drop the hyphen designate.
Yes.
Okay. Joe, so are there other embassies that are on the way or have announced their intentions to send inspection teams in?
There are, yes. So the UK said they're in talks with the North Korean embassy in London about sending an inspection team. And Czech Republic and Poland as well were also we've spoken to, and they said that they are in the process of, they're talking with North Korea basically. They're talking with their counterparts in North Korea about sending these inspection teams when the time is right. That will be done.
The Czech Republic and Poland, who were once 2 members or 1.5 members of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission that was there to monitor the armistice. Of course, Czech Republic was one half of Czechoslovakia.
That is very true.
So North Korea kicked them out. Once Czechoslovakia split into 2 nations, the North Koreans said to the Czechs, well, you've no longer got a right to be here. And then afterwards, they got rid of the Poles too. But they do have a long history of engagement with North Korea.
Indeed. And also Switzerland as well, although they don't have a mission.
Right, they have
famously
the STC, which is the Swiss Development. Now, is it a corporation, company?
Swiss Development Corporation.
Cooperation. Yeah. Okay, right.
And it's the country's humanitarian program. And apparently, they've also said, and this is written in one of my articles, that when the time is right, and they're in contact with North Korea, when the time is right, they will send a delegation to North Korea as soon as they possibly can. And they haven't been operational at all since North Korea shut their borders.
Right. Well, I guess what's handy for the Swiss, just as for the Brits, they've got an active and well-staffed North Korean embassy in their capitals. I'm not sure about the status of what's going on in Poland and Czech Republic, if there are embassies there. I don't suppose you happen to know?
I believe They do have embassies there.
I should know this.
I've emailed them all, but I just can't remember the status of their of what ground they use in North Korea.
Well, and if they're fully stocked, we do know that the British and the Swiss, they're all staffed.
Yes, very true, yeah. And actually, people have formally told us, diplomatic sources, that they actually also check for bugs, and not just the toilets flush and the running water, and whether it needs a clean or a scrub. But apparently, they do also check for bugs and any kind of spy equipment, because they don't trust North Korea, apparently.
Yeah, well, look, I imagine that's probably the same in any country. If you've got an embassy that's been unattended, unmanned, unstaffed for some years, you definitely send in a bug sweeper.
And this is normal procedure. This happens, I say, in any embassy or mission that hasn't been operational for a while, all around the world. Standard procedure. It's nothing special to North Korea specifically.
Right. But okay, that. And those people are highly specialized. Not everyone can go in there and it's not like you just get a Geiger counter. I mean, these are trained people.
No, I would love to see a documentary on one of these inspection teams in North Korea. I'd love to know exactly what they do. It'd be very interesting.
I think it'll be a while before we find out, though, Joe. Now, so I understand, Joe, that North Korea hasn't paid its UN contribution once again on time.
Yeah, well, this is a bit of a funny one. However, actually, it should be caveated that a lot of countries don't pay their UN budget on time. But North Korea, at least for the last few years, have paid incredibly late every single time.
Do we know what's the size of their bill, their contribution?
0.005% of the United Nations budget North Korea have to pay.
Okay. Do you know what that is in dollar terms?
Roughly $150,000. Roughly. Give or take. It changes every year, ever so slightly.
Which is cheaper than the cost of buying a new Maybach, an expensive car.
So cheaper than the car, Imagine, it would be, Okay,
so 150,000. I mean, that's in terms of national budget, it's not a lot of money. It's cheaper than one ICBM.
But there were other countries that have even sort of lower GDPs than North Korea that did pay on time.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily paint North Korea in a good light. However, a United Nations source friend of ours did message me and said he had a problem with the article because he said that there are many reasons, and he's right, and I mentioned this in the article, that, for example, sanctions and the North Korean banking system make it hard and caused huge delays in North Korea being able to pay this. However, North Korea always do pay this extremely late, later than they should anyway, even with sort of, even with them being allowed, the payments being allowed under United Nations rules to be waived so they can pay this fee. But even so, they pay ridiculously late, usually every year. However, the source also said, they didn't feel the article was fair on North Korea. A friend of ours said this. I'm just giving a bit of background and showing a bit of different opinions are available.
Inside baseball. Yeah. Well, and right after this break, Joe, actually, it's good that we're talking about the UN, because I've got my interview with Frode Mauring, the former UN resident coordinator for all the 6 UN agencies in North Korea. I've got an interview with him coming up. So stay tuned, listeners, because after the break, that interview. Joe, thank you very much for coming on. We'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Dive deep into the heart of South Korea's most pressing stories with the weekly Korea Pro podcast. Hosted by Jongmin Kim and John Lee, this weekly 15-minute podcast is your source for thorough analysis on all things ROK. From intricate politics to dynamic cultural shifts, we cover it all. Tune in every Friday on KoreaPro.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Korea Pro Podcast, insight, not just information. Okay, hello listeners, and welcome back to the NK News Podcast. This is the long interview recorded on Monday, the 26th of February 2024. And my guest today, my special guest in the studio, is Frode Mauring. Welcome on the show, Frode.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.
For our listeners at home, Frode Mauring is a Norwegian national who has worked with the United Nations since 2002. He has served as resident coordinator for the UN in North Macedonia, Kosovo, the Russian Federation, the United Arab Emirates, and most recently, from November 2019 to December 2023, to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And that's the part that we'll be talking about today. So, as I understand it, the job of the UN resident coordinator is to lead the UN country team all the different UN agencies in consultations with the government of the DPRK to define and agree on how to respond to different challenges and priorities that the DPRK government has. Is that basically right?
That's basically right. It's provide UN leadership to the UN team on the ground, typically focusing on development and humanitarian challenges. It's the same setup we have everywhere else, and of course also otherwise represent the UN interests in the country.
Now, when you started your term, which UN bodies were represented in the DPRK?
When I started in 2019, there were 6 agencies on the ground as resident agencies. It was the Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Development Program, UNICEF, World Food Program, World Health Organization, and also the Population Program, UNFPA.
Okay, and you are the coordinator for all of those 6?
Absolutely. And of course also in addition, you have the UN entities that have activities that are not present regularly. So you have, for example, UNESCO being active.
Yes.
And then, of course, also we work together on some issues with implementations and support on the ground with Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights as well.
Oh, like the Universal Periodic Review?
Yes,
right?
we could support the government on a UPR process, but most of all, of course, also to offer support in implementation recommendations that they've agreed to.
Okay, all right. Now, you became resident coordinator in November 2019, which is just 2 months before the Pyongyang government shut the doors to the outside world. So I guess the question that everyone wants to know is, were you able to enter North Korea at all during your term?
Absolutely. I was there from 1st November till 17th of January. So I was there, actually I was 17th of January going on a mission to New York to have a donor briefing on a humanitarian program in a view to get resources for our program and to discuss with them needs and priorities in DPRK. And by some bad strike of bad luck, so to speak, we experienced that the border closed behind us.
Right. While you were away, the DPRK government shut the doors and you couldn't go back. So that means that, if I understand correctly, for the rest of your term, you were, practically speaking, a non-resident coordinator. Is that right?
That's correct. We did maintain activities in DPRK. Initially, of course, a lot of my international colleagues were on the ground there, but eventually it trickled out. We had some kind of presence by attrition.
Right.
People needed to eventually go back, and the last one that went out was in March 2015, the World Food Program representative.
Wait, 2015?
Not 2021, sorry.
Okay. So almost, so a little bit more than a year after.
Jet-lagged.
Yeah, okay. So March 2021, a bit more than a year after the pandemic started, the last UN worker left the DPRK.
Yes, and that was when the food aid was depleted, so it was not more that could be done on that file.
Right.
Since then, we operated with the national staff only. But, the closure of the border was not the only measure against COVID that took place in DPRK. Also, movement inside DPRK was restricted, so that even our national staff or international staff that remained until 21 was not able to move beyond Pyongyang. And that, of course, not only restricted the implementation of our program, but of course also severed any new information that we would have from the provinces in terms of humanitarian needs.
Yes, I can imagine. So now, during that period that when you weren't there, the UNICEF representative, I'm going to murder the pronunciation here, Myo Jin-yunt, have I pronounced that correctly, was the acting resident coordinator in Pyongyang?
We separated a little bit the tasks. So I maintained the task as acting and ad interim UN resident coordinator. And then I needed some person to convene and to deal with local coordination issue, and that was the UNICEF representative.
Right. And where were you at the time? Were you in New York or in Norway for the rest of that period?
Initially, when the closure happens, I was in New York, and it was decided then to stay in New York. I was then coordinating there because at some stage they were finding themselves in quarantine and a lot of anxiety. So I was actually in daily contact with video link and initially audio link more because they were confined to their own residences. So,
with your colleagues, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So that was quite a severe time difference. So they had morning meetings and I attended in the evening from New York.
Right.
But eventually the COVID pandemic also hit New York, and then New York itself went to close down.
Right.
And it was kind of a working from home modality, and I saw no reason then to stay in New York. So in collaboration and understanding from my directors in New York, it was agreed that I should go to Norway for some time. But after that, once things permitted, we then moved to Bangkok and reassembled UN country team there. And the reason for that, of course, being in Bangkok, is that you have UN ESCAP, you have the UN regional offices for the most part for Asia Pacific there in Bangkok, with the exception of World Health Organization, which is run from New Delhi. So that was a good place to be, better than sitting in your own living room and talking to screens all day. Is not a good way.
No.
In fact, we learned a lot on how, like the rest of the world, in how to work and how to coordinate and so on and so forth in that way. But it doesn't completely substitute the need for human contact and to work together.
Well, were there North Korean diplomats in Bangkok that you liaised with as well?
Absolutely. I mean, the primary contact that the UN continued to have is the DPRK mission to the United Nations in New York. But there is permanent rep to ESCAP from DPRK side in Bangkok, and he was a very valuable interlocutor. Albeit, as you know, it's not Foreign Affairs that decides on border opening, so they would be sharing information, whatever they had, but of course they so far haven't had that much information because at least until recently, DPRK citizens also couldn't return to DPRK, so they themselves were victims of the same policies.
Would the resident coordinator normally liaise directly with government ministries and agencies, or is there sort of like a one-stop shop that one person you talk to who disseminates information?
That varies from country to country, but in the case of DPRK, in Foreign Affairs, they established under the International Organizations Department an entity called the National Coordination Committee for the United Nations. And they in turn coordinated with other entities inside DPRK that were in touch with us, but also there were direct contacts, in particular with the Ministry of Agriculture, as it was called, but which has now been rebranded as Commission on Agriculture, and then the Ministry of Public Health, being an important interlocutor, obviously, and to some extent also the Ministry of Land Management and Environment.
Okay, yeah, all right. So you had direct contacts. Now, during COVID, obviously when you weren't there, were you having regular remote meetings with DPRK interlocutors based in the DPRK, or only with the mission in New York and with the person you mentioned in Bangkok with ESCAP?
Even for the people who remained in DPRK when the restrictions related to COVID happened, even the team there couldn't meet with these interlocutors, because they were concerned about the potential contamination of COVID. In fact, we had to send not verbal and so on. Only later it was possible to have some meetings, and typically with Foreign Affairs and more linked to practical issues on how to being able to exit DPRK at the time. So for all practical purposes, contacts was through the missions of DPRK to the UN, either in New York, which was a primary channel, obviously, or in Rome for the Rome-based agencies, or in Geneva, and eventually also in Bangkok.
Now, I understand that during COVID, there are a number of different organizations, government and non-government, that began to, for the first time, have video calls with North Korean interlocutors in Pyongyang, like Zoom and other services. Were you also doing that as well?
We were able to establish early on these kind of linkages with our own staff, who in then turn could liaise with the government of DPRK, those we regularly were in contact with, in particularly with Foreign Affairs.
Right.
And we could also, of course, submit verbal via our staff in DPRK by submitting emails and they printing out and sending to them in DPRK. So it was that level of contact.
Okay.
But we were not able to directly have meetings with DPRK government officials. I think also initially there were severe limits to who could have this kind of connections. We do know that there was some participation with the World Health Organization, for example, at some stage through the video link that they have in the old Diplo in Pyongyang, some kind of a meeting facility that we were frequently using when we were there, but very restricted.
That's unfortunate.
Indeed.
Was that a hindrance to the work of the UN agencies, not having the direct contact?
Well, as mentioned, we did have contacts through our local staff.
Right.
So, but it would have been obviously more conducive to advancing collaboration further by technical experts being able to talk to each other. Because you can imagine that those we have in our local staff would not necessarily have that level of expertise, so it would be very indirect way And of course also when we speak to embassy staff or mission staff of DPRK, they in turn wouldn't also have this technical knowledge, so it would be a bit staged conversations that obviously was not that helpful, even though the willingness to help was there, of course, but it's not very efficient.
Right. Every additional channel of communication that's in the pipeline adds its own level of complexity and potential for miscommunication or other things that need clarifying later on, and that just delays the process and makes it much less efficient.
Yes, and of course also you have to understand that initially not only movement of people was hindered, but also movement of goods, which of course led to those who were in DPRK would have less access to sugar and coffee and a lot of basic necessities, so to speak. Although some would argue that it's good to not have too much access to sugar, but at least coffee is a good antioxidant. But joke aside here, I mean, obviously we couldn't get so much supply in, so it was of course not that it would be bringing us ready further to discuss how to accelerate the humanitarian program since we couldn't get supply in anyway. Only in August of 21 was it eventually possible to move something inside, but initially because of concerns about the potential spread of COVID and reports that the virus could stay on surfaces for several weeks and so on. We actually had to keep the supply in 3 months storage, and it was a severe capacity constraint, and the government had other priorities sometimes than to bring in our supply. So gradually the situation improved, and in 2023, in the last quarter, eventually it was scrapped altogether. Gradually it became better and better, down to 1 month and to 1 week, and then disinfection stations and this and that, and eventually kind of back to a bit more normal situation.
What percentage back to normal would you say things are now in terms of getting in humanitarian aid to North Korea? And given the fact that, as far as I understand, there are still no foreign humanitarian workers on the ground in Pyongyang. So what level of back to normal are we?
Well, when it comes to the logistics of it, it is possible to move goods into DPRK a bit as before, as long as it is being prioritized, and because of the backlog has been relatively cleared, we are much closer to normal now than previously. But of course also the only UN workers that are on the ground now is local staff. And although they are very good in many ways, it is of course not the same. So in the situation we've been forced to then prioritize life-saving supply only. And of course these are things that of course are really, really critical for people to survive. Vaccines for children, medicines, pregnant women in childbirth, and of course treatment options for children with severe acute malnutrition, vitamin A supplements, and of course also treatment of multi-resistant tuberculosis, so which without this would be really basically a death sentence over time to not continue getting it.
Has North Korea accepted a large-scale shipment of COVID vaccines?
Not from the UN. We were offering vaccines through the COVAX mechanism. That was the case for other countries as well.
Yeah.
So they were initially basically saying thank you very much, but send it to somebody that needs it more than us, because they didn't have COVID. In fact, the reason for closing the border was to not get COVID as a kind of the zero spread option. But as we all know, in May or perhaps late April of 2022, they got COVID anyway.
They did. Yeah.
And luckily for them, unlucky as it was to get COVID inside, but luckily for them, it was the Omicron strain, so it was obviously less lethal than previous versions. But of course, so the government kind of were able to cope somehow. And they did then resume a vaccination program. We don't know the details of it, but we assume that it was a Chinese vaccine. And they also vaccinated the population against flu, which is also helpful indirectly, because if you get COVID and flu at the same time, that would potentially be terrible for the body to recover. And given the vulnerabilities in the health systems in DPRK, clearly this would not be a good development. So it was a good thing that they did. They should have done it before. They should have accepted the vaccines that was offered.
Well,
because they bought time, in a sense, by closing the border, which they didn't use that much to prepare, and being optimistic about the ability to keep it outside.
So looking back now, 4 years on, would you say that the DPRK government's approach to COVID was not the best one?
I would say that it was, in hindsight even, it was a good thing to be early to close the border, They had the proximity with China.
Mm-hmm.
And they also knew that the capacity of the system to cope with what at that time looked at a relatively lethal disease was very limited. In fact, scoring at the bottom of WHO assessment on dealing with that type of pandemic. I think perhaps in hindsight the capacity was somewhat better in a sense that they have a good local network of doctors, but we've seen from other places that got a lethal version, the early version, original Wuhan strain, so to speak, like India, for example, that they had severe capacity constraint on oxygen concentrators, meaning lack of oxygen and these things, and the same scenario would have unfolded also in DPRK. So initially, that was a good thing. They also requested from us PPE, personal protection equipment. That turned out to be stuck at the border because of the impediment against the cargo movement for more than 2 years.
Which was the North Korean government's choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, not that it was to block that entry of equipment specifically, but it stopped everything.
It stopped everything, yeah.
So of course, and they also fever monitoring equipment and these kind of things. So that obviously was perhaps in hindsight something that could impede capacity to respond later on. And then of course the decision to say no to the COVAX vaccine to initially, not for the whole population, but we even tried to see if we could scramble a bit bigger support to them given the vulnerabilities, but at least COVAX was able to offer for vulnerable population and first responders to be vaccinated. So I think they would have benefited from having accepted that.
Yeah. Now, you unfortunately had to finish your term late last year without returning to North Korea. Did you request to go back before finishing your term?
Yes, we had a dialogue with the mission of DPRK in New York and in Bangkok about these things, but unfortunately the border had not opened, with the exception of Russia and China at the time. So that it did not materialize. As I mentioned, I left for a 2-week mission to New York. I still have my stuff, a lot of my stuff in Pyongyang. I still have, a big passion for a lot of DPRK people in difficult situation. I would have loved to be leading the UN to return, but of course, eventually time flies and I was meeting or reaching the mandatory retirement age at some stage.
Yeah.
And even was even extended a little bit beyond that because it looked like it would be opening late last year, but it still hasn't happened. So eventually it would have to be to hand over the baton to my successor.
So has a successor already been named?
Yes, absolutely. There is a new resident coordinator who has also been accepted by DPRK. So I understand that he would be starting around 1st March.
Okay.
But of course, Joe Colombano.
Sorry?
Joe Colombano, he is in China right now as head of the UN coordination unit under the resident coordinator. He has strong credentials on development side, so I think that would be liked by DPRK.
Any sign from the DPRK mission as to when they will welcome him into Pyongyang?
No, not at this stage. So unfortunately, we'd have to start in Bangkok as well.
Gee, okay. Even though, okay, well, I'll come back to that. As resident coordinator, were you involved in applications for sanctions exemptions to the 1718 Sanctions Committee to streamline humanitarian work into the DPRK?
Absolutely.
How effective were those exemptions procedures?
When we started out in 2019, the exemption procedures were quite lengthy. And also we had the problem that they were only up to 6 months. It is guided by what is called the IAN 7, Implementation Assistance Notice number 7, under the Sanctions Committee. But eventually we were able to, first of all, streamline procedures so that they became much faster within a few days. And also that instead of 6 months, it became 12 months with the possibility to extend. So we saw a lot of streamlining and liberalization on these procedures, but unfortunately, of course, it coincided also with a closure. So that meant that the volume of these requests dropped significantly.
Right. But now that shipments are going back into North Korea, are those improvements in the procedures that you saw, are they still functioning?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the procedure of the exemption is much shorter and the length of the exemption is 12 months rather than 6 with an option to extend.
Yes.
And that's still happening today.
That's still happening today. And that, of course, is beneficial because sometimes, because a lot of suppliers these days, the suppliers are also de-risking. They don't want to spend time on providing offers without having first exemption.
Yeah.
And then you do the procurement procedure. And if you only have 6 months, it would be a risk that this would expire. Then you have to go back to the sanctions committee, having it extended and so on. And this was not very conducive to an efficient handling of the sanctions. So I would say that currently, as far as the UN project is going, yes, the sanctions are causing a lot of work for us, but we are able to cope with it, and it is not a big hindrance in, logistically speaking, in terms of getting supplies in.
Can I ask you for your general thoughts about sanctions on North Korea in general? Are they achieving the intended aims, or are they close to achieving those intended aims?
It's not really my cup of tea to comment on that, because it is the member states that are imposing sanctions, not the UN Secretariat. So in essence, of course, it is the prerogative of the UN member state through the Security Council mechanism to decide whether or not there should be sanctions or not. So one really should have a dialogue with them about motives. What we have seen is that it has had impact not so much on what we are doing. We have been able to find our ways to live with it, so it doesn't cause so much problems for us. But for example, DPRK itself is not collaborating with the mechanism. They're not recognizing them. So, of course, if they need equipment, they wouldn't be able to get that in a legal sense. They could have done that by applying for sanctions exemptions themselves. For example, if you want to have for the new general hospital in Pyongyang, they could have applied for a sanctions relief. But, of course, if they don't have it, the suppliers are not going to be in a position to supply it. So these things, you could see the same on agriculture as well, because not all the things that is being done in DPRK can be done by the UN. That's not unique to DPRK, it's the same everywhere. What the government is doing, what all other organizational entities in any given country is doing is much more important in a sense than DPRK. We could be providing knowledge and niches of activities in certain areas. And that of course, for them is an issue if the government is not collaborating with the mechanism and not recognizing it. So take agriculture. Day one of the sanction, the tractors are still working, the pumps in irrigation is still working. But over time, of course, once you start to need spare parts, once a tractor is not working, once a pump is unusable and so on, it kind of grinds down over time these capacities that would eventually have some humanitarian impact. But it's a combination on how these things are working that would have an effect.
Tell us about the annual needs and priorities plan that the UN's resident coordinator for the DPRK has to compile. What kinds of needs and priorities would be included in that?
Well, first of all, the DPRK response plan, or what was previously referred to as the needs and priorities, it is not only the UN, it's also the international NGOs that are working there, and also Red Cross is collaborating with that mechanism as well. Although, of course, they maintain their independence, but we, of course, share information and is part of the overall plan as well. That contains 4 areas: food security, nutrition, health, and WASH. So
WASH is water and sanitation and hygiene?
Yes, correct. So the biggest area has been nutrition and health, with obviously some longer-term food security issues as well. WASH is important indirectly also for health, because as you can understand, having access to clean water is reducing the risk of communicable diseases, for example.
Sure.
So that is what's being worked on. But in a scenario where we were outside DPRK, the main focus was on health. And because there is where you have the direct life-saving components in the short term, like vaccines, treatment for tuberculosis, some nutrition obviously under that umbrella of what we can do in the short term as well, therapeutic doses of nutrition for children with severe acute malnutrition. So basically what the situation was in 2019 when we last did our assessments was that about 40% of the population in DPRK is having some form of humanitarian need, whether that is linked to vaccines or vitamin A for children, and to avoid stunting and so on, and nutrition support. Stunting is a big issue in DPRK. I heard that there is almost 1 foot height difference between South Koreans and North Koreans.
Yeah, it's quite visible.
So that is huge, and it's of course linked to nutrition when they are children. So all these things is part of the needs and priorities. So in essence, back in 2019, 10.4 million people were identified as people in need. Some of them with very limited interventions like children vaccines, and other with more extensive nutrition support to people. So that is the broad picture of it. Since then, we haven't got any new real information apart from some information from the Ministry of Public Health, where we got information about stock out of medicine, stock out of vaccines and these things. So if it was ever a visible part of the impact of UN presence, it would be in DPRK, because we could clearly see there the impact when we're not there is that the stock went on to zero, particularly compounded by the closure itself as well. So what we have done is that we have adjusted these figures with some knowledge that we're having, but also with the population figures that were adjusted by the census that was conducted in 2019, that was released in 2021, so we could adjust a bit upward with the new population figures. So the current figures is around 11 million in people in need. But again,
it's about one in two, isn't it?
It is about 40%.
Okay, all right. Is it the case that the DPRK is a country in chronic need? Are there always going to be a large number of people in some need of international humanitarian assistance in North Korea?
There's no natural force that would say that DPRK should always be in permanent need. DPRK itself is citing sanctions and, of course, also natural disasters, and lately also the COVID pandemic and the need to close the border as a reason for the current situation. But of course also it has been an impediment that we've been boxed into a limited humanitarian space because we should also work on longer term issues to increase our own food production, to increase our own economy and these things. And of course also now that this has been one of my plans to increase the scope of what we could be doing through so-called nexus issues by bridging humanitarian development interventions in DPRK, and that could, of course, over time mean less dependency. Take, for example, disaster risk reduction. It's obvious to anybody when you think about it. It's a low-hanging fruit, in fact, on Nexus, that if you enhance resilience against disasters, once you have the next typhoon, the impact of it will be lower. So the need for humanitarian aid will be less.
Yep.
So we should do more of these things. That would be more cost-effective also for national taxpayers.
While simultaneously pursuing satellite launches, a successful nuclear and missile program, we have a situation where about 40% of the DPRK population is in need of help. Is that due to a misalignment of priorities by the DPRK government or a misuse of resources?
Well, I would rather put it in a kind of a misalignment issue in a sense that it has obviously been the policy of DPRK to pursue a policy of self-reliance. And they have put obviously much emphasis on strong military in that sense, and therefore allocated a lot of resources to that endeavor. But I have seen signs in last year in particular that a lot more effort has been invested into looking into issues on their own economy and food security. First of all, I think they concluded that they were behind on their 5-year plan, but also it was a lot of buzz about including on the Politburo and including on the Agriculture Commission and a scientific committee and so on agriculture to look into food security. And a lot of these meetings were attended by Kim Jong Un himself, according to their own media. So I think that it is indicative that they want to spend more time and more effort and more focus on improving this side of it as well. But it remains to be seen what the impact would be now that we are not on the ground to support it. But we have been trying to be maintaining our, value proposition by looking at how we could use satellite sensing, for example, in agriculture to be able to advise them better on crops, on impact of climate change and what to do in the future and these things. And we welcome the opportunity, once the border is open, to have an enhanced dialogue with the Agricultural Commission and their professional people in that area to see how we can work together to enhance their own capacities.
How can the international community help out in extreme humanitarian crises in a country like the DPRK while at the same time not appearing to assist the government in its misalignment of priorities or use of resources? It's
important to understand, and I'm not representing the UN anymore, so I can see it a little bit also more freely. But quite frankly, it should be less concern of what is happening through the UN, because we have rather robust monitoring mechanisms in place. Monitoring is something we do in all countries, not only in DPRK, of course. But you could say that in the case of DPRK, the suspicion was that we were not allowed to do monitoring. But in 2019, the last year we were there in force, so to speak, we actually conducted more than 1,500 national monitored missions throughout the country, and that compares reasonably well compared to other countries that we're operating in. So in that sense, the diversion into enhancing military capacity is not happening, and we were not encountering problems in that effect as well. So I think those who invest their development and humanitarian support through the UN should not be concerned that this is being misused.
Okay, but apart from the issue of misuse, I mean, there's another term, I think, is it replacement? Is there a concern that outside humanitarian assistance basically takes the role of the DPRK state and allows the DPRK to use its resources elsewhere?
Yes, this is always a potential concern in all countries. I believe that you get a replacement of what they would prioritize themselves, but I think that in this case it is two issues here. To what extent they would be able to prioritize money. But it's not always only about money, it is also about linking international knowledge to local priorities. And that is where the UN comes into the picture, because it's not the only place in the world where we have challenges of how governments are using its money. I mean, not a lot of conflict countries in the world. Take Sudan, take Syria, for example. We still have a prerogative to support the people in these countries and in humanitarian needs, and to link that also with longer-term issues that affect humanitarian situation. So it's not something that is unique to DPRK.
It has been observed that the DPRK has not been very quick about welcoming the UN or other international organizations back to Pyongyang after the pandemic. In August and September last year, when the DPRK started to lift travel restrictions. Since then, as you've mentioned, we've seen some Russian and Chinese diplomats. More recently, some Mongolian diplomats have gone in. And very recently, 100 Russian ski tourists have entered the DPRK for a snow trip. Are you aware of any aid officers of any countries or organizations that have been allowed or cleared to go back in, or have received a visa to go at least?
No, I'm not aware of any aid organization that has been invited in at this stage, but we do believe and at least hope that this would be something that is fairly imminent, that by middle of this year that we will be entering.
Can you imagine why the DPRK government has been so hesitant to let UN and other officers to come back while they've got the Russian tourists, 100 of them, skiing there? Is it a trade-off between security and secrecy on the one hand while receiving the aid that 4 out of its 10 people need on the other? Are they prioritizing the security element here?
I'm not speaking on behalf of the UN in this regard today, but I would say that it was not necessarily a surprise that they would prioritize the replenishment of embassy staff from China and Russia first, given that these not only are important allies for DPRK, but are also important neighboring countries, of which they have a lot of trade.
But the ski tourist is another matter.
Yes, it's another matter, but I see this also as kind of an element of foreign policy to have some kind of enhanced relations with Russia for geopolitical reasons. I think also what we see is a stepwise opening of the border. We saw first China, then Russia, then also DPRK. People were not able to enter DPRK. So their own citizens were blocked. Now they are coming back to DPRK. A lot of our colleagues, diplomatic colleagues from DPRK, still are not able to get back because it is happening in a sequence matter, and they are not able to know exactly. Some people have gone back and others are still waiting because they cannot change everybody at the same time and so on. So we do expect, I would expect, because I'm not speaking on anybody else's behalf, but that border opening is going to happen soon. And that indeed DPRK is well advised to do so, because I think we have a lot of things to offer in terms of enhanced relations. And I would also say that it is important from the international community side to continue its interests in DPRK and to help the people getting better lives inside DPRK, because otherwise, of course, isolation, walls, borders, everything I have experienced in other complex emergencies and situations around the world suggested that it is never a good thing, and it demonizes the people on the other side.
When you say that you think the border will open soon, are we talking in the first half of this year?
Let's see where we are on that regard by end of June. But I have no magic wand or crystal ball or anything. In fact, I'm not even in a direct loop on what kind of discussions is happening right now. But my understanding is that there is no currently no news. I have heard that some Western embassies has been invited to send some technical staff to go for some inspections and so on there. So I see that as signs that it is continuing to go towards a full opening.
What do you believe will and should be the main priorities for UN agencies when they get back on the ground in the DPRK? The same as before COVID, or will there be a change, do you imagine?
During my time as resident coordinator, which ended about almost 2 months ago, the focus, of course, was to do a lot of planning on what and how to get back and what to do and so on. So one of the top priorities, obviously, is to make a rapid assessment. So we want to do that in a multi-agency approach with focus on these areas that I was mentioning: nutrition, food security, health, WASH, and not to do a very much in-depth analysis that would come later, but to do something rapid.
A rapid analysis. Okay.
Rapid analysis.
Yeah.
So that we could be able to talk to the international community about the resources needed. So a top priority for us would be in collaboration with the government always, in the case of DPRK, to conduct such an analysis to be able to revert back. In parallel to this, of course, I would also say that it would be useful to start a dialogue with the government to see what could be potential nexus priorities inside, because we do know that DPRK always wanted to have more long-term development. And the long-term development is something that the international community, through the sanctions, is skeptical to.
Well, yeah.
And but there are some, as you mentioned, low-hanging fruits here. There's also risk reduction and some global agendas. And let's see what is it that they will be most interested in, and have a dialogue with the international community and the sanctions committee and key member states on these issues to see how we can expand the envelope in relevant areas.
Do you anticipate that there'll be any new challenges in working with the DPRK government going forward, or will it be the same as before?
It's hard to say. I mean, obviously, 4 years is a long time. And we also seen that there has been a lot of statements about changing philosophy on unification and of course also other global events where DPRK has aligned itself strongly with Russia on the Ukraine war. I mean, I don't see that directly having an impact on the program that we should do in DPRK, but of course it takes two to tango, as we say. And I hope that the good relations that we had in 2019 in terms of working together would continue. But mind you that I was sent there in 2019 because at that time it looked that there was some interest in DPRK to downsize the UN inside DPRK, with the argument being that we were bringing less resources to the table.
Right.
But I'm hopeful that in the spirit of collaboration that we could be able to get a lot of accelerated support to making lives better for DPRK citizens in the future. And that should be something that the donors would be interested in. But to be frank, we are in an environment now globally where money is tighter. There's a lot of priorities in other areas caused by numerous conflicts, and not only Ukraine and Gaza, which are the obvious ones in the news, but there are tons of other issues on the African continent. For example, Syria is still an issue. We have recovery efforts from earthquakes in many places, including in Turkey, into Syria as well. And this is, of course, coming from the same limited pots of international taxpayers.
One theme that comes up regularly in conversations on this podcast is that there seems to be a conflict or an opposition between those who do humanitarian work on the DPRK and those who do human rights work on the DPRK. And often it seems that there's a split, at least between the people and the groups, that those, for example, humanitarian workers will often not appear at the same conferences or speak on the same stage as human rights workers because they're worried about being cut off from DPRK access. Must each group or individual focus on either one or the other? Do you see that split as being an important one?
Listen, I've been working in many complex environments in the world, and it's not unique that you would have to have some level of division of labor. So I think the share of the task of those who are resident agencies would necessarily be not, say, accountability part of the human rights agenda, more the part of where is it that we have some common ground? What are the human rights issues that has been raised in the Universal Periodic Review, for example, where DPRK itself has agreed to some recommendations, and we can work on them. And it is a formula that has worked well in other countries. Vietnam, for example, the UN has done a lot of good work there in enhancing capacities in addressing human rights issues, because human rights is a wide agenda. And I know that Special Rapporteur of UN Special Rapporteur of Human Rights in DPRK is also focused on looking more into the situation of women and children, and that of course tallies well with the things that we could do on the ground and something that should be possible to do without too much controversy vis-a-vis the DPRK authorities as well, and that perhaps can maybe reduce the kind of tension around human rights issues, because it's a broad agenda. And we should be able to do a lot of things to support them, like we do in other countries, in realizing the human rights. And mind you that human rights challenges and the recommendations in the Human Rights Council is something that is not unique to developing countries. It's also happening for all countries. My own country, Norway, is also getting recommendations of things that needs improvement.
Now that your term as resident coordinator in the DPRK is finished, do you feel that you have finished with the DPRK completely, or will you continue to try to be involved at some level in some capacity?
If I can be useful, I'm at the disposal of whoever needs me. I have a lot of passion for a DPRK, of course. There is a lot of, good people there, and once you've been inside and to see things at the other side, obviously you see the human dimension. And I have passion for that, and I hope to, in one way or other, be relevant still.
Great. Well, we wish you all the best with that. Thank you very much for coming on the NK News podcast today, Frode Mauring.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
It's great to meet you. In the intricate world of Korean affairs, tailored intelligence makes all the difference. Korea Risk Group's consulting services offer specialized, actionable intelligence designed to guide your Korea-related decisions. We provide bespoke consulting services that cater to your unique challenges and goals. From policy analysis to market entry strategies, we bring clarity to complexity. Transform uncertainty into opportunity and visit KoreaPro.com Solutions today. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.